Hello, hello. You are listening to The Long Game, and I'm your host, David Ly Khim, co-founder and CEO of Omniscient Digital. In this episode, we chat with Mike Walrath. Mike is the CEO and chairman of Yext, the publicly traded digital presence platform that enables brands to manage and sync their information across search engines, apps, and AI-powered platforms. Before Yext, Mike co-founded WGI Group, a growth stage investment firm. Before that, he co-founded and chaired Moat.com, which was acquired by Oracle, and he founded RightMedia, which was acquired by Yahoo. Mike has deep expertise in search, advertising, and data infrastructure, and he's been at the forefront of multiple technology shifts that have shaped go-to-market strategies and digital discovery. In our conversation, we talk about the business evolution of Yext and how it started as a lead gen business and is now a brand visibility tool. We talked about the fragmentation of online search, building a web for AI agents, and building a resilient business when markets are tough. Mike was candid, thoughtful, and a joy to speak with, and I hope you enjoyed this conversation with Mike Walrath. I gotta say, I've watched a bunch of other interviews you've done, and
the fish is always there.
The fish is always there. I was wondering which background we were gonna get.
Yeah, it's usually the fish.
Just a really quick intro for folks. So you're currently CEO at Yext, amongst a plethora of things, and I'm gonna be completely honest. I haven't heard about Yext in what seems like years, and based on my research on the business, it seems like it's gone through a couple of different twists and turns. So I'm curious, if you were speaking to someone in the audience who doesn't really know what Yext does, how would you summarize that in a few sentences for folks?
Depends on your definition of a few. I'll do my best to keep it brief. So I've been around the business initially as an investor, then as chairman. So I was an investor since about 2009, chairman from late 2010 until March of 22. In March of 22, I officially and unexpectedly took over the chief executive position as well. And I think that's part of the story. The story of Yext is really interesting. It was a very high, sort of high flying growth company in New York City. One of the first, I think, scaled software companies to come out of New York City. That is really credit to the founding team. Howard Lerman and Brian Distelberger identified a market need, at one of these moments of changing, fragmenting, evolving markets, and brought exactly the right solution to market at the right time, circa 2010, when the mobile device was just, sort of changing everything about the way that businesses, particularly local businesses, were discovered. And that really, kind of launched the growth trajectory of the company for the next decade or so. Went public in 2017, had a really big growth path. And, that sort of started to change. I'd say 2019, we started to see that there was a real shift happening in the environment, that people were becoming far more dependent on Google as the primary mechanism by which they became, by their products, services, locations, storefronts, financial advisors, anything with kind of a local tilt. Google became the place where you got found, and a lot of the other platforms, other services just became less and less relevant. I think one of the best, and I'll get these numbers a little bit wrong, but I think when we started the sort of core Yext business in 2009, Yelp was something like 65% of all online reviews.
Yeah.
Period. Full stop. Like, I don't know what that number is today, but it's way under 15%, I think, or 20%. And Google's by far the biggest sort of review engine out there, right? And so that's kind of emblematic of, in a lot of ways, the fact that 2022, maybe early 23, we peaked out where Google had about 92% of all search queries.
Yep.
Which really meant that, if you're and for just about every business, 92% of your kind of external traffic or discovery-based traffic came from Google. And I think that was a very difficult period for Yext. So We had invested a tremendous amount in infrastructure that enabled marketers to organize their data and deliver that data to hundreds of endpoints. We knew there was virtue in that. We knew that there was SEO benefit. We knew that citation building was really important. But it became a really wonky SEO discussion that CMOs who were really excited about kind of how to make their brands discoverable in 2010, 11, 12 across the kind of fragmenting mobile world lost a lot of interest because it felt like, hey, if I'm good on Google, I'm good.
Yeah.
Right. And so the company, I think, really kind of pivoted around looking for the growth engine. Some of the experiments went really well. Some didn't go well. And in the last couple of years, I think what we've seen, and I'm trying to encapsulate a lot here, and I'm definitely using more than a few sentences. What we've seen is that there is a tectonic plate shift happening in the market that is like what we saw with mobile, but it's probably 10 or 100 times bigger. And I believe much more durable, that will create challenges for marketers around making their brands visible in much the same way that the mobile evolution did.
Yeah, I want to dig into that. I'm curious. You kind of said in passing here, there were some experiments that went well and some that didn't. Is there one that didn't go well that maybe you were surprised about or you were excited about that maybe didn't make the cut?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think it's so when it became clear that marketers were looking at, sort of, were I'd say less focused on organizing and distributing their local information. One of the things that the company developed was an enterprise search platform. Oh. And so there was Howard had this, what I think was a really bright thesis around marketers need to make their information more discoverable. And if it's not on third-party sites, it should be on their own websites.
Interesting.
And we saw some really interesting use cases around, financial services businesses building find an advisor platforms that were really, kind of built around the notion of a Google-like search experience that was specific to their proprietary information. Yeah. We've seen find a location, find an advisor, find a provider. And that was actually a really great fit for us as a business. And to this day, I think it's an area of strength for the business. Unfortunately, I think what, the company did, and in hindsight, this is really easy to see, was that the pivot to that ambition to be an enterprise search company was just way too big. Mm. Instead of 10% or 15% of our energy going towards a set of use cases that were really fundamental to our customers, we pretty much just shifted the whole company to it. And had that worked, first of all, I wouldn't be sitting in the seat, and they'd be writing books about this like unbelievable sort of moonshot pivot. It just didn't land, and I think no one has really figured out how to land that enterprise search use case as like a mega growth thing. Yeah. I think a lot of ships have kind of crashed on those rocks. And so a couple of years ago, we really refocused the business around what our core customers wanted, which was increasingly a consolidated set of tools around managing their brand visibility. And ultimately, that's led us to what I think is a sort of pivotal moment in the market where the value of controlling your own brand visibility is going to become more important than ever.
Yeah, that makes sense. It's not the same, but it reminds me of my time when I was at HubSpot. I was there for about 6 years, kind of saw it from 2015 to 2021, which I think some of us would consider the golden age. And that was when we launched. We went from marketing to becoming a CRM company to a sales automation tool company. And each time we launched these new, like we went into service, customer success or customer support tools. Each time there was a new product, customer base was always so confused. Like, wait, I thought you were a marketing company, but you're doing sales and customer service tools now. And it was always some process of, and that's not even that far from marketing, right? But I imagine such a big pivot for you all that probably must have shocked everyone.
I think it was a combination of it distracted us from our mission. Yeah. Right. And that mission, look, it's again, if it had been more successful, then we wouldn't be talking about it as a cautionary tale about losing focus. We'd be talking about it as like, this is exactly what you do when your core business is threatened. Yeah. But because it didn't work, instead it becomes this kind of cautionary tale of like, be careful when you pivot. And now the flip side of that is like Yext as it exists today, right? Which is not an insignificant company, 400 and, call it, well over 400 million of revenue. We don't give formal guidance anymore. So, and and a lot of free cash flow. Like that business exists today because of this kind of fearless pivoting. So the business was a pay-per-call marketing engine that that was never going to scale. Neat product early in the transcripting space, selling leads based on what was the sort of in the phone call. But it was never going to scale. And so I think the thing was, and again, it's just all history, is that the fearless pivoting created the company as it was. And it created this pattern recognition around like the bigger the pivot, the better. But it's a different environment when you're trying to pivot a large public company than when you're pivoting a startup. And so again, like I own all of this because I was here for it. I was chairman of the board for most of it. And, these mistakes are my mistakes. But I think that's actually the thing you figure out in 25 years of entrepreneuring is like, the only way you grow is you screw things up and then you move forward.
Oh yeah. I'm very familiar with that, and owning it, of course.
Yeah. You got to own it and like, break it and then move on.
Yeah. A big thing that is happening in the industry right now that you're kind of starting to allude to around like the fragmentation of search is how it's impacting organic search, particularly. We have a organic growth agency. A lot of our clients focus on Google, now focusing on LLMs and all of that as search platforms. And I think the majority of people are seeing traffic decline, and it's due to a lot of different things. But I'm curious, as like you're kind of knee deep in all this. So like, how are you advising marketers or marketing leaders? Like what should they be doing right now?
Yeah. Well, so it's a big, I think it's a big question. I know you're probably dealing with your customers every day. We started to notice this, I would say 5 or 6 quarters ago. And I think initially, it sort of sent shockwaves through our organization because what we're seeing was just like the number of so for most of our core customers, the big thing is the local pack.
Yep.
Right. So it's because they tend to have a geographical, they really need to be represented in that local pack because so much of the discoverability around a financial advisor or a healthcare provider or a restaurant or a hotel is the hyper local element to it. And so we just started to see about 6 quarters ago, maybe a little bit longer, that impressions were falling on that map pack. Mm-hmm. And I think that the first signal was, wow, is ChatGPT actually eating this much Google questions that we're seeing these huge impression drops? And I think when we dug in, what we found was that wasn't the case at all. It was like it was kind of a false signal. And what was actually happening was Google was experimenting with different ways to deliver those answers, right? So in effect, they were turning on AI mode or AI answers in the map pack for things that were, I'd say, traditionally not necessarily as monetizable.
Yeah.
Right. So this was the example I like to use is like if you type emergency plumber near me into any Google interface, you're going to get a highly monetized, highly localized answer to that question because that's a highly monetizable query. If I type, and I use this example all the time, so you've probably heard it before. If I type, do I need a plumber to fix a clogged toilet? I'm going to get an AI overview that says, look, try a plunger. And if that doesn't work, then I'll recommend some plumbers. And that'll be a monetized interface, right? And so what we saw Google doing was really just shifting unmonetizable queries into their sort of AI service, which meant less impressions on the map pack. But what we actually saw were no real variations in clicks and conversions and calls and things like that. So they were really just selecting the sort of zero action queries and setting them, for lack of a better way to describe it, into a zero click type answer.
Yeah.
If that makes sense.
And I'm not sure how much this relates to local businesses, but something that's coming up a lot takes many different names now: GEO, generative engine optimization, AEO, answer engine optimization, LLMO, whatever letters you want to use.
Yep. Yeah, sure.
What's your take on all of that right now?
Well, look, it's impossible not to sort of see it all and hear it all. And I don't know, there's a dozen or more startups that have been sort of launched in the last 6 months, probably just around that concept. I think at Yext, we look at it a little bit differently and maybe a little bit more holistically, in the sense that because we've lived in a world where like to get your brand visibility, whether it's local brand visibility or sort of capital B brand visibility, right? You have to, kind of start with structuring your data correctly and then distribute to all the right endpoints. And that's kind of a direct and an indirect distribution. I think when it comes to this idea of GEO, what we're seeing is nobody really knows how to influence these black boxes today. They don't know, sort of, we have a playbook for Google that we've developed over the last 20 years about how to influence the SERP page and ranking and things like that. But it's this, I think what's charging a lot of these conversations is just ChatGPT, Grok, Perplexity, Gemini, Siri, when they, sort of finally align on what their LLM based solution is. They're all going to be a little bit different, presumably, in how they decide what to surface and what to talk about. And that then creates, I think, a real risk and a real opportunity for marketers who have just deployed so much energy against this idea of like, it's all about visibility on Google. And so that shift that I think people thought we were seeing 6 quarters ago, I think now we're actually seeing it. And what we're actually starting to see is like, if you look at your traffic logs, you're getting a lot more traffic, coming from both the sort of crawlers and bots from AI, which is a whole nother discussion, but also then more referral coming from those sites, which means that those sites are getting better at giving actionable answers to questions. And the real question for marketers is how are they deciding what the answer is going to be?
Yeah.
And that I think is fundamental. And whatever we call it, what it is it's about brand visibility and brand sentiment. And for marketers, that's, I think this new frontier is going to be, what are the things that I can do actionably, or the actionable things that I can do, built off of a really granular understanding of what the competitive sort of visibility environment looks like. They're going to help me across all those different answer engines.
Yeah, it's really interesting. It's like, at least from my seat, we do get a lot of questions from clients about this, and we needed to have an answer. And I think fortunately, like, we have an experimental culture where we're like, all right, what can we try to do? What hypotheses do we have? Can we get some data on what's working? And we've run enough experiments to have some conviction on how to influence these LLMs. But the caveat that we tell every client is this is a window in time. Like, this might work now. It might not work in 3 or 6 months when the next models come out, but here's what we have conviction behind. And I think it's almost that certainty or some sort of guidance that folks are looking for. And I think we've kind of positioned ourselves to be able to help with that. But it is, I mean, I try to empathize with folks who are in marketing leadership where it's already a tough role. And now there's all this flux and they're trying to figure out, like, what are we supposed to be doing? Like, can we at least take some action to gather some data on what works? And you can either view it as like risk off and kind of sit on your hands and wait, or, hey, let's go experiment. Let's make some small bets and validate some things. And that's what we're trying to get more folks to do.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think, you can always look at these things through a lens of fear or through a lens of opportunity, right? And I think the historical lesson is that, there are plenty of examples of companies who figured out sort of, who hacked or got great partners, who helped them figure out, like, what is it that gets me a lot of traffic from Google, right? And before that, even like, what gets me a lot of traffic from, sort of the predecessor directories to that world.
Yeah.
And I think, it helps to introduce the discussion with marketers around this framework of, look, if you figure this out sooner, right? And if you invest in the data tools and analytics to tell you which of the things that you are doing are helping you to drive sentiment, AI visibility, inclusion in their answers, then you're going to, you can build a kind of durable advantage and you'll be ahead of that curve. And you'll be less concerned about the fact that, like, okay, like, my traffic from Google is dropping, right? If your traffic from Google is dropping, and actually, I think even further than that, like, what if all the referral traffic is dropping?
Yeah.
Right. Like, at the end of the day, what I care about if I'm a restaurant owner is, are people coming through the door, right? Or ordering through DoorDash, right? What I care about if I make product is, does that product sell? I really shouldn't care that much if they come to my website and buy the product, or if they are using an agent to buy the product or some other mechanism.
Yeah.
And so that's the world I think we're entering. And it's going to be super fun to try to unpack like what works today. And like, my sort of core thesis is that a lot of the things that we do for SEO are going to work in the short term around AI visibility. And we see this in our data. Like, if you are doing all the right things in terms of structuring your content and having the right schema and having your page structured correctly and reviews and photos and all the other things that influence Google and Bing and other search engines, you're going to have, you're probably also hitting the things that are behind that are grounding those LLMs today. Yeah. But that doesn't mean that's going to be true. As you referred to before, that's going to change every time they, OpenAI seems pretty satisfied today using presumably Bing as the primary index behind their experience. And then, there's sort of some supposition that they're also experimenting using Google's index. And maybe they'll decide that they're going to find a way to build their own index, right? And that'll change everything.
Yeah.
And who knows what they'll do, right? I think one thing we know for sure is it's hard to predict what they're going to do next.
Yeah, 100%. And I think just going off what you just said earlier, where, maybe you're not building for humans and you need to make sure that all your data is structured correctly.
Yep.
You've talked about this idea of this agentic web where your next customer might not be a person, but an AI agent. Can you talk to us a bit about that? Like, what does that mean for how you build a website and how marketers market, how brands get found?
Yeah. Well, so I think there's a couple elements to it. And so the framework that I think is most useful is to start with it sounds hyper futuristic to talk about like, well, everyone's going to have agents doing things for them. I think maybe and I use those words, so I'm criticizing myself here, but maybe an easier way to think about it is like if we have assistants who have context, right? Whether those assistants are human or those assistants are not human, AI, right? It's the same principle, right? So it turns out I'm in Manhattan a lot, right? I order lunch to my office most days. And believe it or not, I don't actually do that. My wonderful assistant does that for me. And the amount of information that transfers between she and I on what I'm gonna, this is a silly thing, but what I'm gonna have for lunch that day, running between meetings is very few words because she has context and she has memory. So she knows the things I like and she knows the things I don't like, right? This is what the world of the agentic web is going to look like, right? Is context and memory going to be such an important part of how our assistants help us to do things that it's going to fundamentally change the whole discovery mechanism. And so like, for people who use ChatGPT, it's fun to go into your ChatGPT and just look at its memory, right? And see what has it intuited rightly or wrongly about like who you are. But also you can program its memory, right? So I can tell it, I went to the University of Richmond and I prefer to do business with people who also went to the University of Richmond. From now on, every question I ask ChatGPT for the rest, until I change that memory or ask it to use some, or ask it to forget that memory, the query will effectively become, where's the nearest dentist near me? Sort of, and the context for that query will always be, and by the way, if one went to University of Richmond, that will be preferred. In much the same way that I can tell it, like, I don't eat seed oils. I'm allergic to X. I prefer this kind of food. I don't eat meat. I'm a vegan. You can teach it all these things and your assistant will have context. So what it's looking for now is it's looking for places where your preferences and your context match up to the structural data of the business that you're looking for.
Yeah.
Right. And I think, and again, sorry, I'm probably going deeper than you wanted on this.
No, this is great.
But like that I think is the part that marketers are just beginning to understand, is that you're no longer like, if you think you make the best double cheeseburger in Manhattan, you're no longer in the business of marketing best double cheeseburger in Manhattan. You're in the business of marketing everything that there is to know about your business that might be relevant to the agent or the consumer, right? And I think that last piece I would talk about is that difference between there's the agent and there's the human being, right? And there's the eater, the consumer of dental cleaning, whatever it is. And so that human being will happily browse your image-laden drop-down box website and find information. It'll go in, I'll go in and I'll find, I want to look at the bios of the dentist. I want to see where they went to school. I want to see how they were trained. I want to see how long they've been practicing. I want to see if they like dogs, whatever, right? And so, we've built this whole web to be navigated by human beings, and it's heavy and it's slow. And if you're a bot, it costs a lot of compute to absorb this whole web in order to find the structured data that you're looking for. My AI assistant knows what I'm looking for. It knows what my preferences are. It has memory. It has context. And so it's seeking depth in that information. And I can create content in the form of pure data that will be much more consumable to that AI agent. And I think that's the world we wind up in, is I will just replicate everything I've built for human beings into, sort of pure data that I pump into the veins of all of these different answer engines. And that to me feels like that's what I mean when I talk about like the agentic web versus the human web.
Yeah. And what does that mean? Like the content would be in quote pure data. Is it just like in a randomized string, like an embedding, or something else, like a different format?
Yeah, I'm not sure we know the how yet entirely, right? Like, because I think we know how Google wants to consume it, right? So, they've given us APIs and interfaces, and we can claim our business, and we can verify and get a postcard, take a picture, like do all those things, right? So we spent 20 years figuring out, how does Google want to consume our structured data in a way that it can, it can return that data to the human race in different ways, right? If I take a website, any website, right, but take a sort of, I use the example all the time. You take Wendy's.com and you measure the total weight of that website in terms of what it would take to render that website, right? It's like megabytes. It's like just like massive amounts of data. If I take all the structured data that's on that website, nutritional facts, locations, hours of operation, allergy information, and various other things like that, it's probably 25 to 50 kilobytes.
Yeah, it's not much.
Of like structured text data. I believe, and this is a prediction, and predictions are dangerous and I can look stupid, but I believe that there is a huge incentive for the answer engines of the future, the AI agents of the future, the things that we talk to and they give us advice about where to shop and what to buy and what to eat and things like that they're going to create pathways for us to deliver that data to them, so that they don't have to come and download our heavy websites and images and things that they don't care about.
Yeah.
And so I'm not saying that we won't need websites. What I'm saying is that we need mechanisms to deliver the pieces of the website that are interesting to the AI. And it's in everyone's interest for those pathways to be developed.
Yeah. It is interesting to start seeing there's these browsers now that are being launched with AI in it, like Perplexity released their comment browser. The browser company released Dia. ChatGPT is rumored to launch one soon. Google's embedding Gemini into Chrome a ton more. I try to use some of these and I'll say, hey, what's my availability for meetings tomorrow? And it's a really silly thing, but I'll have both my calendar and my fiance's calendar, and it'll take both into account and say, like, you have no availabilities because her calendar is crazy.
Right.
But it doesn't know I'm just asking about my calendar. So it's one of those really weird things where maybe there wasn't something in the data structure that says, hey, only a look at the calendar associated with this email. So I'm really curious where this is all going to go. I'm along for the ride. It's exciting.
Yeah. And I think it's really interesting. I think the browser play is sort of a consumer play, right? It's how do I get the consumer to use my services and my agent and my, and I think we're going to see this massive inflation in the number of searches. And really, when I say search, the number of questions that get asked and answered, right? We're already seeing this. You ask ChatGPT a question, and it's going to give you an answer. And then it's almost always now going to ask you a follow-up question because it wants you to continue to engage. It's gathering information about you even as it is delivering you information. And so when you flip it and you say, like, Look, the browser thing I think is mostly relevant to businesses when it comes to where are going to be the platforms that have the ability to, that are going to be most important, that talk about my brand, that direct users to my brand directly or indirectly, drive traffic or just drive commerce. And so, in most of our conversations with CMOs and CIOs and CDOs and CEOs even, it's about, what do you do as a business to be prepared for the fact that, like, we don't know who's going to be dominant. We can be pretty sure at this point that we're not going to live in a 92% monopoly anymore, because, that's a whole nother story, but it's just, once you start to lose consumer share, you're not going back to that. Google's not going back to that level.
Yeah.
Another crazy prediction. Because I just don't think we're going to go back to a place where Google is 92% of all questions, because we've crossed the Rubicon where the ChatGPT and Perplexity and Grok and all the other AI experiences are actually better experiences for the consumer than the ad-laden, highly commercial Google search experience. Yeah. And, Google will not sacrifice $200 billion a year of paid search revenue to, hold their share. So they'll kind of walk this line, and that'll result in lots of erosion of that share, which will result into a really robust marketplace for questions and answers.
Yeah, it's interesting to get to see this shift in real time. And I'm a shareholder. I'm deeply invested in Google. I have Google Pixel Phone and Google Home and everything.
Oh, yeah.
And despite the crap that they've gotten over the last couple of years, they seem to be doing a pretty good job of at least trying to defend their moat. Like, they're shipping pretty quickly for such a large company. And
yeah,
I'd say a lot of their AI experiences are not optimal yet. Like, I agree that other platforms have better experiences, but it's interesting kind of, you can probably relate to being what some might call a wartime CEO, of trying to navigate all of this and go against these competitors and changing markets.
Well, it's funny. The thing I can relate to most is the position Google's in. So, part of my, history is that from 2008 to 2010, I sort of oversaw the search marketplace business at Yahoo. And I learned a lot about that world in doing that. It wasn't my sort of core, kind of expertise going in. Marketplaces, I understood the puts and takes of consumer search behavior and paid search monetization was something I learned on the job in a very difficult environment, simply because our native search, our organic search wasn't as good a tool as Google, but then we were also monetizing it much more heavily. And so it was very painful for us to consider, pulling back on the monetization in order to try to just retain some level of parity with Google. In 2009, Google, I think half the time they didn't deliver an ad on the page. Right? It was there would be one sponsored link, and they were still just producing a lot of money. Now you look at Yahoo had 3 ads on the top of the page. And, people would, they'd come in and they'd be like, hey, your page is so heavily monetized. And by the way, there were times, I think, during the quarter where there were 4 or 5 ads, and sometimes maybe even the organic results weren't above the fold. And so, we knew that was going on. There was little we could do about it. I think in a lot of ways, Google as a search business is in a very similar position today. They are much more highly monetized than any other search and find experience out there, particularly any AI search experience. And so in order for them to really deliver a consumer experience, especially to a generation of consumers who didn't grow up just thinking of Google as being the only place you found anything, they would have to take virtually all of the monetization off that page. And that is, I think, just something I believe they will be reluctant to do. And you can kind of see it in they're not growing share. Search queries aren't really growing at 12 or 13%, but their business is.
Yep.
The revenue is, right? And so it tells you they're turning the monetization screws, even as they're shifting unmonetizable traffic into AI experiences. It's all very clever. And I wouldn't, want to have to deal with the problem that they have. And then people always say, "Oh, well, then you think we should short Google?" And I like, my answer is always absolutely not. Like, you don't want to short YouTube and Waymo and all the other things that Google has.
Yeah.
But if you could isolate and short just their search business, that I would do.
Well, I want to change gears quite a bit here. One of the things that you've talked about in other interviews was you've openly talked about this shift that even at Yext of like from growth at all costs to prioritizing profitability.
Yeah.
I think you referenced The Outsiders a couple of times as well. I love that book.
It's my favorite. It's like the Bible.
Yeah,
I make everyone read it.
You talk a lot about this. I think the phrasing you use was like a gravity environment versus a zero gravity environment, or like going from, ZERP era to, very much not ZERP era.
Yeah.
What does this all mean for how businesses are built and scaled, and like how you think about leading in this environment?
Yeah. So I think that, we got drunk on this sort of free money, right? And before there was total free money, what there was this huge sort of tailwind of, what was, I think, novelly referred to in, kind of call it 2007 to 2015 as like, we're going through a digital transformation. Every business needs to make their business digital. Before that, it was like you were either a digital business or not a digital business.
Yeah.
Right. And then I think, what happened was that just drove an extraordinary amount of like, kind of tech spending, IT services, software, all those things. And so even before we went into this like crazy free money, zero interest stuff, there was this kind of tailwind. Then we sort of exacerbated that tailwind in this kind of long-term zero interest inflationary environment. And so, the crazy thing about it, and I think for Yext, the sort of, the chickens came home to roost early, if you will, because we were one of the few software companies that wasn't helped by the pandemic.
Yeah.
Right. So, we were actually, our sort of focus was on helping businesses drive foot traffic through their doors. Right. And so right around, March of 2020, everything about trying to convince customers that there was value in driving traffic through your doors got harder. And so we kind of had to we were living in a world where we were trying, and this was where some of the aggressive pivoting to new growth engines came from. We all believed at that time that the only way to be recognized and to have value was to be growing at 30+%.
Yeah.
I don't know who came up with that number.
Some VCs.
Right. But it was like religion. It was like dogma, right? Like if you're not growing 30% as a software company, you're useless, worthless. And you'd read like Jem and Ball would like send out his cloud of judgment email every week. And you'd look at it and you'd be like, my God, every software company is growing at 30+%. Like we really do stink if we're not doing that. And so what happened was like, it became such a sort of, it just consumed all the oxygen in the room. And it was, you're dead if you're not growing 30%. Right now, like fast forward to today in a gravity environment, how many software companies are growing above 30%?
I'd say almost zero.
I think it's either 0 or 1, right? And it depends on, sort of how much you factor so Palantir is the only one that I think is close right now, right? Mm-hmm. And that trades for 100 times revenue. And yet every one of our peers in the kind of front office space now trades for like, 2 times revenue, right? And so there were certain things that we said as an industry, I'm just going to personalize the industry, like if you're not growing 30%, you're dead. And default, sort of valuation is 10 times ARR, right? And so it's funny because like very few companies have 10 times ARR. ServiceNow, Palantir, maybe a couple other ones, Snowflake and Datadog might still be around that range. But like reality has come back. And it turns out that fundamentally what we forgot is that free cash flow is the primary metric, right? It's behind every value of every business. And even if you're going to justify Palantir's 100 times revenue, you're going to do it based on some, long-term kind of 10-year projection of what kind of cash flow that business can actually produce. And so I like an environment like this because I think this kind of trading off of like, obviously, if you can get growth, you should get growth. But we're a lot healthier as an industry when we're having the conversation around like, is the growth there? me just relentlessly spending into the growth, which was, by the way, one of the things driving the growth, right? So it was like one of these, sort of schemes where we were all buying software from each other. And the more employees I had, the more software I had to buy. And we were so we were just hiring and our growth rates were, and I mean, I've talked about it a lot publicly, like it's not a sustainable way for our industry to develop. And, now I think we'll see shifts that are a lot healthier over the long run.
Yeah. Yeah. I remember when I first started our business, not SaaS, but like tech enabled and all of that. And I was honestly venting to a mentor of like, oh, it feels like a bad time to be an entrepreneur. It's so hard. Like interest rates are high and people don't want to spend. And thankfully, he reframed it to me. He said, hey, if you can build a business in this environment, imagine when the environment's more favorable. So it was a good reframing for me of, like this means we're building a business the way, like in a very healthy, sustainable way.
Totally.
And then later, like build a good balance sheet, and then we can invest in growth when others are, not in as good as a position.
Absolutely. And I think that the culture of companies that get built during tougher environments actually, so it's, I think to me, it's really interesting. If you look at a lot of the sort of best in class, like software companies of the last, 5 to 10 years, many of them were like 2007 to 2010, 2011 vintage companies, right? Or maybe even a little earlier. So they were created during a time when like software was hard to sell, right? You were still fighting on-prem. You didn't have scale. AWS wasn't there, so you had to build data centers. Like there was all this stuff that you had to do during that time frame. And so, those companies, now they ultimately got sort of fat and happy on easy money and lots of growth. But like at the core of those companies was like, we did it when it wasn't easy. I don't know that history will judge the sort of, 2015 to 2022 vintage of software companies as, as nicely, because I do think in the end of the day, like a business that started during that time frame will be less resilient and will, I happened to come into the industry at like the worst, the tech industry in 1999. I went to work at DoubleClick. There were like 9 rounds of layoffs in my first 2 years at the company. So like, I just was like, sort of beaten down from the beginning and like beaten into this mode of like, I started my company in 2002. It was like, there was nobody wanted to buy anything. You couldn't raise money. And so we just like had to bootstrap it. And I think in a lot of ways, like it was the greatest thing that could happen to me.
Yeah.
Because it taught me like exactly what you said. If you build a great business and in a tough environment, then like it just gets easier when things get better. And I think right now we're hopefully sort of at the tail of what's been a really significant recession for tech spending and IT outside of like sort of pure based model spending.
Yeah. I didn't realize. So RightMedia was fully bootstrapped. So when you exited, that was like all you and your co-founders.
No, we did ultimately raise some capital, but like,
okay.
I left the company that had spun out of DoubleClick, I guess at the end of 2002 and started RightMedia. And there was the only venture capitalist in New York City at that time was Fred Wilson, and he did consumer stuff. So I knew Fred, but he wasn't going to invest in like sort of kind of fledgling software with a crazy idea about trading media. And so my business partners, Jonah and Noah Goodhart, kind of wrote the angel check. And then for 2 years, we had to figure it out. We were like, begging companies to hire us to like be their buying agent so that we could build the technology behind the scenes.
Yeah.
And it wasn't until middle of 2005 that we raised growth capital because we just couldn't. And we were in 2005, we were building data centers, right? There was no AWS. Wow. So it was like, we had taken on MySpace as a customer serving ads, and MySpace was blowing up. And we were pretty much like, we can't continue to build out enough data infrastructure to like auction these ads off. And so we had to like go invest in infrastructure. And that's pretty much what we did with all the venture capital because we had built a profitable business. It was a really interesting time.
You're playing business on hard mode compared to now.
Well, I don't know. Yeah, I mean, I would say like the one thing that we had going for us there was like, I don't think anyone thought in 2002 or 2003 that the industry was going to recover as quickly as it did. And so I talk to a lot of younger entrepreneurs about this who are struggling right now, that like, you're not going to realize, it may happen in the second half of this year, it may happen next year, but like there's going to come a point at some point in the next 2 or 3 years that you're going to wake up and realize like, oh wow, it's not as hard as it was, and I have different problems. I have more opportunity than my sales team can interact with. I have, and those are, you know, really good problems. And so, but they always kind of catch us by surprise after like, 3 or 4 years of like drudgery, which I think is where we're living today.
Yeah.
But it's cyclical. This stuff cycles.
Yeah. And so you had sold your business. You were chairman of the board for, I think it was 12 years. Yep. And then I think you used the words, you reluctantly joined as CEO. Yeah. And I don't know if all of that is like public information, but I'm curious, like, what was that thought process like? Because I imagine you weren't chomping at the bit to take it on, but you eventually did. So I'm curious how you thought about that decision.
Yeah, no, it's so what happened was, I think really the company had come to a crossroads, and Howard had done such a brilliant job, and Brian and others had done such a brilliant job building the company and building this growth engine, that when the growth engine stopped working, I think there was just an element of like, it's time for another chapter, and so and that really kind of, I think, came to a head in the second half of 21. We're beginning to see kind of cracks in the free money environment, and so the company, and this has sort of been talked about, kind of got very close to going private at that time, and ultimately, I think it was hard to culminate that transaction when it was unclear what was like fundamentally wrong with the business, and so I kind of did the only thing that any reasonable non-executive chair would do, which is I hired Heidrick and Struggles and said, let's go find a CEO who wants this headache. But someone, I think, had to put their hands on the wheel in that period of time. And I volunteered to do that. And over the course of that kind of 4 or 5 months, what I figured out is there was this like amazing kernel of both talent and technology in the company. And so by the time we got around to like having a list of potential candidates, I was, at least toying with the idea of continuing, which had always been like, when I left Yahoo in 2010, I always said, I'm never going to operate again. Like, I'm going to do a ton of stuff and really interesting things and help entrepreneurs, which is the thing I'm most passionate about. But I'm done with the like sort of CEO deal. And so I'm sitting on, sometime in probably like February of 22, I'm sitting in my living room, and, I'm sitting on the floor and I'm talking to my wife, and she just kind of looks at me, and we're kind of talking it through, and she looks at me and she goes, so like, how much longer are we going to just pretend you're not doing this? And it was kind of at that moment where, it sort of shifted from like, I'm doing this temporarily to, okay, I'm kind of doing this permanently. Now, in hindsight, like, it was still zero interest rates, right? March 9th of 2022 is when I officially announced that I was taking the job. And 1 week later, Jerome Powell raised interest rates for the first time. And so there is, absolute certainty that I massively underestimated the challenge that turning this company around in the public markets was going to be. I think we all assumed at that point there was going to be maybe, a couple quarters of difficulty, and then we would sort of iron it out as an industry. And, we've seen what's happened since then. But I'm really proud of the team and what we've accomplished, and we're a much healthier business today. And I think we have a really bright future ahead of us in terms of, sort of a lot of the headwinds to our business over the last 3 or 4 years are beginning to turn into, I believe, tailwinds. In terms of, strategic conversations with enterprise customers who really need to do a better job with data management and data delivery for their brand visibility. And so it's been a journey for sure.
Yeah. I love it. You kind of went in as interim leader, and maybe you saw kind of a spark or a diamond in the rough, and you're like, wait, there's something here.
There's clearly something there. Yeah.
What did that decision mean? So again, I did some research. I saw that you were doing other things during this time. You bought out, like your partners in the Surf Lodge, which is really cool. You helped a friend produce some films. You did some investing. What did it mean for all of those things? Are those even happening anymore? Or are you just like, those are off to the side, you're focused on Yext and...
No, so they're all happening and they're all thriving. And so, really what I spent my time on between 2010 and the whole, RightMedia to, 4.5 years and sold it to Yahoo, then worked at Yahoo for almost 3 years. And that was sort of this epic sprint of entrepreneurism, and then kind of learning, sort of how to operate inside a big company, and, learning a bunch of things that I actually didn't realize at the time how useful they would be to me now. And then, I sort of, when I left Yahoo in 2010, I really checked out in a lot of ways from the world of digital advertising. And a lot of people said, "Are you going to do another one?" And I was sort of like, "I'm probably not." Like, I kind of did that, and I'm going to probably focus on something else. So I focused on, helping Yext. My business partners ran a company called Moat that we co-founded that was a brand visibility, a viewability and brand analytics platform. And I spent those 12 years really kind of being in the mode of like, I'm here as an advisor and a sounding board, and I'm here to help in any way that you might need. And that included like investing in a crazy golf apparel company that has turned into a huge success with a brilliant founder. But the key for everything that I did at the time, with one notable exception, was really, I'm not going to be sort of a single point of failure for this business. And so by design, I could come and go and not, have the business suffer. So anytime that there sort of came a thing in any of those businesses where it was like, if I'm going to become a pivot point that, I need to pick up the phone on a Tuesday afternoon, then I'm not going to take on that responsibility. And so that was probably the biggest, I think, psychological shift of going back into a full-time role, was like, there is no off button in this world. And, the commitment is that you're always available and always on. And most of the time when you're always available and always on, it's for something that's not that pleasant to deal with. Sometimes it's fun, but a lot of the times it's an emergency of some sort or the others. But all those other things are kind of thriving, and they have, sort of brilliant entrepreneurs who are leading them. And, someday I'll get back to kind of, that sort of world of being an advisor to entrepreneurs more than being a day-to-day operator. But right now we're having fun slogging through the mud of this difficult environment.
Yeah. It's a fun time. And I do, I found this old profile of you in the New York Times back in 2014. You probably know what I'm talking about.
I know what you're talking about. It's like, this is why I don't do traditional PR anymore. I got talked into that thing. And I still have friends who like, the photo.
The interesting thing I caught was you wanted to be the Thomas Keller of New York. I'm a big fan of the hospitality industry. I read like, Unreasonable Hospitality and all those books. Yeah. But you had talked about having a low profile, and I just thought it was funny that you're doing a podcast tour now, and that's not very low profile.
No, but here's the thing that's different about it. And my team is, I think, is beginning to understand this, is like, I believe, like, I don't view podcasting as the same thing as, this conversation you and I are having. Like, it can't be misrepresented. Right. And I actually think that's what makes this medium so powerful. So I think one of the things about, like, every time I've ever sat for, and I don't really do it for any kind of an interview or an article in the, what you call like a sort of traditional publication, the spin and the sensationalizing or whatever it is that comes out of that, it just, to me, it's inauthentic to the point where like, I shy away from it. I think podcasting is the best medium for, sort of these conversations, because, like, first of all, like, people spend a lot of time consuming it, but we spend a lot of time and thought like delivering it, and it's who we are actually. Right. And so that's why I do this. Like, I am pretty much a yes on a lot of podcasting, and I'm pretty much a no, as my team will attest to, on a lot of other forms of kind of traditional media engagement. Just because I find it much more authentic.
Yeah. Well, I promise you won't find any random quotes taken out of context after this or anything.
Appreciate that.
So I want to be mindful of your time. If people want to learn more about you or about what you're building at Yext, where can people find that information?
Yeah. So as far as Yext goes, yext.com, we've got all our socials on LinkedIn and things like that. I, in a lot of ways related to our last, sort of piece of our conversation, I keep a very low profile personally. I do maintain a LinkedIn presence that I don't visit very often, but I actually don't post on any social and haven't posted on any social in 10 years or more. That's just a choice that I make personally. So people can find me on LinkedIn, or they can find me through friends who know how to find me. And other than that, Yext has all the platforms that anybody wants to find.
Yeah, it's taken care of. Well, I love and respect that a ton. And thank you so much for making the time, Mike.
I appreciate it. It was great talking with you. Thanks, David.